My name is Billy Laster. I'm the Deputy Secretary for the Department of Public Safety. I'm over Juvenile Justice, and we're really glad to be here with you today. Today I've brought LaToya Powell, who's General Counsel for the Administrative Office of the Courts, and Judge Corpening, who is the Chief District Judge in New Hanover and Pender counties. And we're going to tell you a little bit about the School Justice Partnership. And as Mr. Ford just mentioned, this is a new initiative, but it's not really that new. The law was passed in 2017 that raised the age of juvenile jurisdiction from 16 to 18. That law also included a number of other components, and one of those components was the School Justice Partnership. It was the last part of that actual legislation that passed. It was in the State Budget Act in 2017, and today we're going to tell you a little bit about it. And the reason why we're just now coming to you is because we have just now released the Toolkit. And I think that we've got copies of the Toolkit that LaToya will walk you through in the presentation. If you'd like a copy, we can give you, we brought a few with us, but we can also get more copies sent to you of the Toolkit. And the Toolkit actually walks through how local communities should be having these conversations about school justice partnerships. So what is it? The School Justice Partnership is a conversation at the local level between school officials, law enforcement, DAs, judges, juvenile justice staff about how we should be treating school discipline issues and how we should be treating criminal justice issues. And where is that line? Where does the line fall between criminal justice issues and school discipline issues? And so why is this an issue that's coming up as far as raise the age is that we really wanted to look at this issue because when we look at juvenile justice, 42% of all juvenile complaints filed in the state of North Carolina last year came from where? Schools. All right, 42%. Just think about that for a second. Of all the complaints, which are what you would consider on the adult side, adult arrest, we call them juvenile complaints on the juvenile side. 42% of all of them that occurred in the whole state of North Carolina last year occurred while on a school campus or related to a school issue that occurred. And so that is a significant number of that population coming into our school systems, into the juvenile justice system from the school systems. And we want to really focus on what's causing that to occur. What are the issues that are driving those kids into the juvenile justice system? Because we know once they get into the juvenile justice system, their likelihood of dropping out of school increases. Their likelihood of not graduating from high school also increases. And so we really want to look at, is there a better way to handle those cases moving forward? So as I said, 42% of them come from the school system. Anybody want to guess what the top two offenses are that come from school districts that come into the juvenile justice system? I heard it. Disorderly conduct. Someone said disorderly conduct. That's number one. Disorderly conduct made up almost 1,400 complaints filed on school campuses last year came from the offense of disorderly conduct. What is disorderly conduct?
Who knows?
It's true.
It's in the eye of the beholder, right? Disorderly conduct means that you disrupted the educational environment for more than 2 students, all right? That happens every 5 seconds in a school in the state of North Carolina. I assure you that there's a disruption almost every day, every moment of the day that occurs in schools across the state. So how do we choose when those are disorderly conducts that need to go in the criminal justice system versus being handled as a school discipline issue? The second one, most common offense, is what we call simple affray. What's a simple affray? A fight. A small fight is simple affray, meaning it's a small fight where nobody got hurt. If somebody got hurt, you would have been charged with assault. And in fact, assaults can be for things like yelling or cussing somebody out. That can be an assault. So this is even smaller than that. Simple affray can be a kid running into another kid, bumping into another kid in the hallway because they're mad at each other. So simple affrays are small fights that occur on school campuses. And I always say, think back to when you were in school. Those top 2 offenses, disorderly conduct at school and simple affray, if you were to have done those behaviors as a kid in your school, would you have been arrested for it? And I think generally the answer is no. We would not have been arrested for it. I am not saying there was not an intervention for the behavior. What I'm saying is that the intervention that we turned to was not the criminal justice system. We looked at school discipline policies and procedures that we could do on our school campuses to deal with those behaviors. And I know in my household, part of that intervention, because my mom was a teacher, a school board member herself, part of that intervention that principal would have taken was pick up the phone and call mom and dad and make sure that they had an intervention waiting for me when I got home also. When we throw a kid into the criminal justice system, what happens? We automatically create an adversarial relationship between parents, the schools, and law enforcement. Because if your child is in trouble with the law, what is the first thing you want to do as a parent? Make sure my child doesn't get charged. Make sure my child doesn't end up in jail or in a juvenile detention center. Make sure they don't have a criminal record that's going to stick with them for the rest of their life. So parents are thinking defensive first. And if they get an attorney, the first thing that a defense attorney is going to say is don't accept responsibility. Don't say you did anything until you get to court and we have a conversation about that. What's the exact thing we want kids to do? Take responsibility. Be accountable for their behaviors. When we throw that into the juvenile justice system, there's a delay in those things happening. And Judge Corpening always puts it this way, because if you think about how long it takes a kid to go to court, think about your own child. If your own child misbehaves in your household, you're at the grocery store and they throw a temper tantrum at the grocery store to get some chewing gum, what is your response? Is your response to have an immediate reaction to that behavior and have some type of accountability for that behavior immediately? Or do you say to them, you know, in 90 days, let's have a talk about this? That's exactly what's happening right now in the court system, because the case gets continued, and typically 90 days down the road, what happens? The judge looks at the kid because nobody else is there to testify in the case and says, there's not enough evidence here, I'm dismissing the case. What does the kid learn from that? That they got away with it. There was no consequence for the behavior. And so that's why we really want to look at how do we make sure there's immediate consequences for behavior, but also immediate services for that child to make sure that they can be intervened with appropriately and have the services that they need to be successful moving forward. So part of the Raise the Age initiative, we just got funding from the General Assembly that the governor signed into effect, includes additional funding through our JCPC funding mechanism. These are juvenile crime prevention councils. They're in every county across the state of North Carolina. They put in place diversion techniques to allow for kids to get services in that local community that is a diversion from the juvenile justice system or detention or commitment facilities. Those dollars are being released right now in local communities, and we're asking JCPCs to prioritize looking at how do we create alternatives in communities to keep kids out of being suspended, expelled, and ending up in the juvenile justice system moving forward. I've been working on school safety most of my career, and when this really started to drive home to me was we had a project that was called Youth Outside of the Educational Mainstream, YOAM. And we went and worked with school districts that had high suspension rates, and we actually went to school districts that had low suspension rates, and we got mentor sites to go into those other schools to see if we could reduce the suspension rates. And I remember one of the first schools that we worked with, we had a kid on that school campus that told his best friend, I'm going to shoot up this school. The reaction of the school was that that best friend did exactly what we would hope that a best friend would do. They went and told the principal. And the principal's reaction was to do what? Suspend the child. They called him down. They said, I heard you're going to shoot up the school. And the kid said, yep, going to do it. I'm going to shoot up the school. So they suspended him for 10 days. What happened 10 days later? He came to school and tried to shoot up the school. Why? Because in those 10 days, we did nothing to try to intervene on their behavior. We didn't try to change what was the root cause of what drove them to the system in the first place. We didn't go to their house to see if they had a gun under their bed. We didn't offer mental health services to find out why this kid was threatening the school and to shoot up the school. We didn't send anybody to the home to figure out what was going on. We just expected if we suspended a child for 10 days, they come back 10 days later, a well-adjusted young man ready to learn in our classrooms. And that's not what happens. And so we've really got to think through, I'm not saying that kids should never be removed from the school environment. There are absolutely situations for school safety needs that kids need to be removed. But in the meantime, what are we doing with that child to make sure that they're going to be successful when they come back and be ready to be educated in that learning environment. So today we're going to tell you a little bit about the School Justice Partnership and how that works, and we really would like to get your support as the State Board of Education about this. The Governor and the Chief Justice, along with many legislative members, came to a forum we had right down the road at a high school here in Greensburg to introduce the Toolkit statewide. And we've seen since that time period over 37 local education agencies reach out to us to get more information about the School Justice Partnership. So we're really excited about the momentum that's building on this issue. And today we're going to tell you a little bit more about the School Justice Partnership and what role you guys can play in that, and give you some more of the details. So I'm going to turn it over to LaToya Powell. LaToya is an outstanding advocate on this issue, understands the issue very well, and is the author of the Toolkit. Spent many years working with all the stakeholders across the state to come up with the Toolkit, including the Sheriff's Association, the DA's Association, the School Boards Association. We've been working with groups to try to make sure we have a document that everybody can work off of to produce these justice partnerships moving forward. So LaToya Powell.
Good afternoon. Before I get into the details and tell you all about why we hope that you will support the initiative to expand school justice partnerships throughout the state, I want to share with you a video that we put together at the North Carolina Judicial Branch to help communities understand why this is such an important program. The very first school justice partnership was established in New Hanover County through the leadership of Judge Jay Corpening, who was the Chief District Court Judge there. And that school justice partnership has been very successful. It's been in existence for about 3.5 years now. And so, you know, very frequently I go out and talk to groups like you and other stakeholders to tell you all about what school justice partnerships are and why you should support it. But it's much more effective to hear from the actual people who are engaged in this work. So we have a video where we've put together some of the stakeholders in New Hanover County from all of the various groups, the schools, law enforcement, courts, DA's office, who are engaged in this work. And so I want to start by letting you hear from them about what school justice partnerships are and why they're so important to North Carolina.
I didn't know about all the data outcomes that were possible. I didn't know about all the educational research when I first started doing this work. I've learned about all that since and see the power of keeping kids in school and out of court, keeping kids in school and off the street.
We were getting to that point where we were taking students for what were basically school offenses and adjudicating them in the court setting, which was not the appropriate place to do that. We wanted to put it back into the schools, keep the students in school, keep the SROs in school, and try to stem those problems that arise when children end up with criminal records that they don't need.
I think most people would agree that violent crime, people who are on a bad path, those are the ones that need to be the focus of the criminal justice system. But in the vast majority of these cases where it involve behavior, principals need to be in charge, not prosecutors.
Last year, more than 11,000 children were referred to the juvenile justice system from the schools, and only a fraction of those offenses were very serious ones. The one thing we know is that when we see referrals from the schools to juvenile justice is that these young people are less likely to graduate from high school, more likely to repeat a grade in school, and more likely to later on be charged as an adult for more serious offenses. Our courts must focus on making sure that our young people are successful.
Our philosophy is we have to keep the kids in school. The statistics show if they're suspended, if they're arrested, their chances of success diminishes. And it also takes a school liaison officer away from the school if you make a custodial arrest. And with the day and age that we're dealing with now, we want to keep as many officers as we can on or around school campuses. We do not want to pull them off of campus to have to go to the jail or have to go to court because of an arrest that they made that we could have dealt with in a different way.
We put school resource officers in just about all the middle schools and high schools in my district. And then things that had been discipline issues, just boys being boys in many cases, were suddenly showing up at the courthouse rather than the principal's office.
In North Carolina, until raise the age finally happens, some of the consequences, 16 and 17-year-olds are still going to adult court. And collateral consequences for those kinds of tags can be lifelong and life-changing. Research says that if we can deal with the behavior in school, outcomes will be better than if we refer it to court, even when we have a high-functioning juvenile justice system.
A typical day prior to the partnership is if you had a child that was acting out or there was disruptive behavior, the consequences would end up being a custodial arrest or some form of suspension or expulsion. And what the partnership does now is it looks at ways to avoid that. Can you deal with it in a different way? Can you deal with it in a way that keeps that kid in school?
The School Justice Partnership is really an agreement among multiple agencies, law enforcement, district court, the prosecutor's office, as well as the school system, to try to reduce the number of juvenile offenses that come from the school to the courthouse, because that kind of arrangement doesn't serve anyone.
It has been a powerful experience in my community, in New Hanover County, in my home community, where across systems we've come together to build a model where we've agreed that we want better outcomes for kids in school.
With this school justice partnership, over 50% of our prior cases are now staying at the schoolhouse in a principal's office rather than coming to the courthouse to be handled by my prosecutors. That's going to give us the capacity to handle the 16 and 17-year-olds that are going to be coming with Raise the Age and really focus our priorities again on violent crime and the ones that are repeat offending. We reduce crime and keep everybody safe by doing this school justice partnership.
The main goal of the School Justice Partnership was to help kids. It was to provide them opportunities to graduate. It was to provide them, when they graduate from us, that they can go on and not worry about having a criminal record for something that happened in high school. And to make sure that when they apply to colleges or apply to the workforce, that they're ready for that and that they're in their best position to do that. So at the end of the day, we're helping kids, and that's really what we're all about.
We've been at this now for just over 3 years, and this was the idea of our Chief District Court Judge, Jay Corpening, to stop what's commonly referred to as the school-to-prison pipeline. And it's been a wonderful thing to watch over these last 3 years.
In the year before we started our School Justice Partnership work, about 88% of students who are referred to SROs, to school resource officers, got sent to court. Last year it was about 24%. We still have some work to do on our disproportionate contact, but we're talking about that. But we have seen a dramatic reduction of all children being referred to court.
And I think the benefit to this partnership is now it's focused on keeping kids in school and helping them succeed. And it also, at the end of the day, it makes the school safer because the officers are spending more time there on campus building relationships, safeguarding the school. And that's just very important for us in this day and age.
There's not anything else we do that's as powerful as this tool to positively impact the lives of children. Most of what we do day in and day out negatively impacts the lives of children. School justice partnerships give us a chance to get out ahead of that and change things for the better for thousands, tens of thousands of students across North Carolina, especially as we look at the impact moving forward over the years. It's important. It really is.
So it's really important, again, to share that video because you heard from the leaders in New Hanover County who oversee the school system, the superintendent, the Wilmington Police Department, the head district attorney. You heard from our chief district court judge that this is a program that is helping children be more successful. And when we see how this is working, how it's benefiting various communities in North Carolina, why wouldn't we want this to happen all over the state? Why wouldn't we want something like this in Guilford County, in Wake County, where I live? I want my child to go to school in a school district where educators and other stakeholders in the community are engaged in helping him to be more successful. And so that's really what this initiative is all about, helping children be more successful by removing those burdens that they carry for the rest of their lives when they end up with a criminal record because they've been placed in the court system for minor misconduct. So I want to thank Judge Corpening and his wonderful leadership that he has in New Hanover County for helping us put together the video and just for being such a supportive network as we have tried to develop tools and resources to help other communities learn how to do this. You've already heard Billy talk about why or sort of what the impetus was for School Justice Partnership expansion. It all started with Raise the Age, which was enacted in July of 2017, but of course we know it won't become effective until December of this year. School Justice Partnerships was a part of Raise the Age because the legislature realized that it's going to require a lot of money and resources to now bring tens of thousands of juveniles into a juvenile court system that many think already was kind of overburdened. So if we can remove some of the really minor misconduct from juvenile court that maybe we can deal with elsewhere, such as in the school system, we suddenly increase the capacity for North Carolina to raise the age of juvenile court jurisdiction. We know from many years of data and statistics that the older youth are more likely to commit more serious and violent misbehavior. So those are the types of offenses that we want our courts to have the time to focus on and to expend our resources on. Raise the Age is going to move 96% of 16 and 17-year-olds from criminal court to juvenile court. The reason for that is because it affects the less serious offenses. All of the misdemeanors and low-level felonies that previously were automatically charged as adult offenses when the child was 16 or older will now be handled in adult court, while the Class A through G felonies, which are the more serious and violent offenses, will continue to go to criminal court. But what we know from our data is that the serious stuff only accounts for about 3% of the crime committed by teenagers. So as a result of that, the vast majority of older youth who previously were being convicted as adults will now be served in the juvenile court system. School Justice Partnerships, as you heard Chief Justice Sherry Beasley say at the press conference, is a very important part of this legislation. The reason, again, not only does School Justice Partnerships help to reduce some of those court referrals, it's also designed to reduce exclusionary discipline as a whole. And so what I've been told is that one of the key initiatives of this board is to reduce exclusionary school discipline. So School Justice Partnerships fits squarely within the goals that you already have as a board. Because again, our goal is to try to keep kids in school and out of court for some of that minor misconduct. Here's how we define a school justice partnership. Just very simply, it's a collaboration of stakeholders, including all of you in this room, including other leaders in your community who have a decision or a voice in how we discipline kids for school-based misconduct. Whenever schools initiate charges and send kids to court, all of a sudden we've got the court system involved, and the court system is now a disciplinarian. When we have school resource officers in school who make decisions about whether to charge a child or file a juvenile complaint, now we've got the sheriff's office or the local police department as a stakeholder in deciding how we implement school discipline. The DA's office, parents, DSS potentially, because some of our kids end up in the child welfare system based on how we respond to school-based misbehavior. So a school justice partnership brings all of those folks to the table to have a conversation about more effective ways to address minor misconduct without sending so many kids into the court system for very minor misconduct. And I want to keep emphasizing minor misconduct because I know that there has been some information going around about school justice partnerships that was probably not accurate. And it's because some of the people who may have been sharing that information have not been involved with the initiative or don't really understand it. School justice partnerships really are designed, again, to address that disorderly conduct offense where somebody yelled at a teacher. No one was harmed, no one was injured, there was no threat to the safety of students, school officials, or the community at large. What we're talking about is the minor stuff that does not impose a public safety risk. How can we more effectively address that type of misbehavior in a way that doesn't place these burdens on children that are going to make them more likely to drop out of school and then commit additional misconduct in the future? So you've already seen, and I know that probably everybody in this room knows, most of our cases from juvenile court, almost half, for many years, have come from school-based referrals. And so this chart here only goes back to 2010, but if we go back a little bit further, you'll see that that has been a constant, that school-based referrals account for a little over 40% for several years in North Carolina. And so while we see that over time, the overall number of juvenile justice complaints has declined, school-based referrals have remained steady. There really has been no change. So how can we look at this data and have a conversation about ways to address that? That's what we're trying to do with school justice partnerships. This is a room of educators, so I don't have to tell you about the school to prison pipeline and how when we place kids into the court system, into detention and jail, who maybe have a minor risk for reoffending, how that just the initial contact itself is going to increase the risk that the child will later become arrested again, will potentially drop out of school or have to repeat a grade because of all of the missed instruction time. Many of the kids who are being charged and sent to court are our kids who are already at risk of academic failure. So you think about a child who's struggling to maintain grade level, to just keep up with the minimum grade level requirements, who now has to miss 3 or 4 days of school because of multiple court appearances. Maybe the child is on probation, and now they have to have various appointments with the juvenile court counselor, or their family is required to go through various services or comply with various restrictions that have been imposed as a part of the juvenile disposition. All of those things are removing the child from the classroom. A child who already is struggling, which is obviously going to make the child more likely to fail and not be able to move on to the next grade. So by keeping kids in school, keeping them engaged in instruction, keeping them connected with pro-social activities, with positive role models, adult role models. Many of these kids come from communities where, quite frankly, the only positive adult role models they see are at the schoolhouse. Why would we want to remove those kids from an opportunity, from the environment that hopefully will help them to become more successful and more productive? So whenever we place kids in the court system, these are some of the consequences that we've already talked about. Until December of this year, for our 16 and 17-year-olds, just think about how many tens of thousands of 16 and 17-year-olds now have a criminal record because they got into a fight at school. How is that going to impact that 16 or 17-year-old when he or she graduates from school and tries to get financial aid to go to college, tries to enter the military, or to get a job? I mean, just something as simple as getting a job or an apartment, you have to disclose whether you have a prior criminal record. So we have been placing our children at a disadvantage for a long time, just sort of because of these unintended consequences. And then we know also from our data that the deeper a child gets into the system, the worse off they will be. So for example, children who are just charged but are not ultimately adjudicated delinquent have better outcomes than those who are actually adjudicated and then receive a disposition of detention or probation. So the deeper they get into the system, the more harmful those consequences are. And then Billy already talked about the disproportionate impact. Again, this is a room of educators, so I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. But with school justice partnerships, we have the opportunity to address so many things that benefit our children, including reducing the disproportionate impact that exclusionary discipline has on certain groups of children. And so these are just some of those groups that we know are more likely to be affected by referrals to court or suspension based on the same misconduct as some of their peers are committing. When we look at youth of color as a whole, our juvenile justice data tells us that youth of color are 2.5 times more likely than white youth to be referred to court. They're 1.5 times more likely to be placed in detention once they get there. And by that, I mean, at the time the child is charged, there's going to be a decision about whether that child gets to go home to their family and to the court date, or if the child is going to be placed in secure confinement pending further hearings in the case. Youth of color are 1.5 times more likely to be placed in secure confinement. When you narrow that group to just African American students, the outcomes worsen, or the disproportionality gets worse. So black students are 4 times more likely to be suspended or expelled, and almost 4 times more likely to be referred to the court system than white youth. And what we've seen with our school justice partnerships is that not only do all of the numbers go down just as a whole, but we also see that disproportionality start to drop off as well. And again, these are just based on data from juvenile justice as well as DPI, based on your publicly available data. We know that our students with disability, boys are more often than girls suspended and referred to court. And when we eliminate those types of exclusionary discipline practices, we see lots of improvements, including, again, the reduced disparities, the more opportunity for academic achievement, and an improvement in school safety. Kids are less likely to continue engaging in misconduct when we are using evidence-based strategies that address the underlying behavior. Oftentimes just arresting and sending the kid to court when, as you heard Billy say, 90 days later the case might just be dismissed without any type of accountability whatsoever is not a very effective strategy for correcting the behavior. So how do SJPs work? This is about a conversation. It starts with a conversation initiated by the Chief District Court Judge, who serves as the convener for the School Justice Partnership team. The Raise the Age legislation defines school justice partnership in a way that requires Chief District Court judges to serve as conveners, not to tell everybody what to do or to force their community to do this, but to say, hey, can we have a meeting to talk about school discipline in Guilford County and try to look at some more effective ways at doing this that's not sending thousands of kids to court every year. That team should include, again, all of the stakeholders who have a say in how kids are disciplined for school-based misconduct. So obviously that means the schools, not just the school administration, but principals, teachers, school board attorneys, all of the school officials who have a say in school policy surrounding school discipline. The ultimate goal for the School Justice Partnership is to develop a memorandum of understanding that specifically defines the role of school officials and law enforcement in responding to school-based misconduct. If students are misbehaving in class, just sort of engaging in minor disruptions that don't necessarily constitute a crime, is it appropriate for the teacher to call the school resource officer? Many of us see these videos on YouTube where maybe something started out as a disruption in class, kids not listening, won't follow directions. All of a sudden, the school resource officer gets in there. If this is a kid who has some sort of underlying emotional or behavioral issue, that might have triggered whatever the underlying disability is. And so some of these kids become more combative once they're approached by a school resource officer. And all of a sudden now we have a resisting a public officer, disorderly conduct, maybe a simple assault, because there was the intervention of a school resource officer where maybe that wasn't necessary. So part of what the School Justice Partnership MOU does is it tries to set clear guidelines for when it's appropriate for school officials to address the behavior and when it's appropriate for a law enforcement officer to do so. It also has the goal of limiting the use of court referrals and other types of exclusionary discipline for minor school misconduct. So what many of the MOUs do is specifically outline the type of misconduct that should warrant a referral to court versus the type of misconduct that maybe can be addressed through some sort of in-school consequence or a community-based consequence. Sometimes it's as simple as calling a parent. If your community has a teen court program, that's a referral that can be made without having to initiate a juvenile complaint. An SRO can refer a child directly to teen court or to another type of JCPC program. Maybe you have juvenile mediation or some other type of restorative justice in your community. These are the types of outcomes that can be placed into a graduated response model that provides a multi-tiered system for responding to misconduct based on the nature of the behavior and the sort of frequency of the conduct. So if it's the first time, for example, that a child has been in trouble and it's a very minor misconduct such as disorderly conduct, the graduated response model would typically say you should do something other than immediately initiating a juvenile complaint. So that's what the purpose of the graduated response model is, and that is why counties that have implemented these MOUs have been successful in reducing their school-based referrals, because again, this is about minor misconduct. So most of the types of offenses that are addressed by the School Justice Partnership are ones that ordinarily would not warrant charging and sending the child to court for the first offense. The toolkit that we developed at the judicial branch, again through partnerships with other stakeholders who are a part of this collaboration, is a guide. It's a framework for how to do a school justice partnership. It does have templates such as a model MOU, a sample graduated response model, so that you can see. And what we've done is we got Judge Corpening and his team to come to the table and talk to other stakeholders about what they were doing that had been effective. And we put it into this toolkit to help other counties so that if you want to do this, you don't have to start from scratch. You have a toolkit that you can flip through and step by step see how other communities went about developing a school justice partnership. But every county or every school district who has a school justice partnership should design an MOU that meets the specific needs of your community. Guilford County's school justice partnership probably won't look like New Hanover County's. Your data probably looks different. Your resources probably look different. You have to decide, and that's part of the conversation that should occur with stakeholders, what is the issue? Do you have an issue? What types of misconduct need to be addressed? And then what resources do you already have in your community to respond to some of the needs of the kids in your community? So this is, again, about developing a unique tool that works for your community. You can use the MOU in here as a starting point, but it's something that should be developed through a collaborative process that happens at the local level. It also has research on effective school discipline strategies. So we talk about things like teen court, juvenile mediation, youth mental health first aid. There's a tool called the responder model that is a way to address kids who have underlying mental health issues. And as educators, I'm sure you all know how important it is to address mental health in schools. Judge Corpening has been a very strong proponent of increasing mental health resources in the courts and in his community, and we've tried to address that in the toolkit by giving school systems and other stakeholders some ideas about how to use that in your school justice partnership. Currently, we have about 12 counties that have officially implemented a school justice partnership. And so what that means is they've gone through the process, they have developed an MOU that has been signed by all the stakeholders and implemented in the various school systems within those counties. Many of these counties are sort of very fresh and very new in implementing their school justice partnerships, but the work started many months ago because it's unlikely that you're going to meet one time and then a month from now have an MOU. This is a process. That's why we have the toolkit that provides a step-by-step guide to take you through that process. This should include meaningful conversations, reviewing all of your data to try to figure out what's going on in your schools, what types of misconduct is being referred to court, who's being referred, what do the kids look like, what are some of the issues that these kids are having. Do you have the resources and programs available to address their needs? If not, how can you get more? All of those things are what the stakeholders figure out in their stakeholder meetings and then use to develop the MOU. So the work that these counties have done to get to the place where they have signed an MOU took a lot of time, but hopefully it was worth it because we hope that these counties will have the same experience that New Hanover and some of our other counties have had with their school justice partnerships. So I want to share with you a few statistics that show how successful school justice partnerships have been here in North Carolina, as well as in other parts of the country. How many of you have heard of Judge Stephen Teskey from Clayton County, Georgia? So one person. Judge Stephen Teskey is known as the pioneer of the school justice partnership. In 2004, he took it upon himself to call a meeting or convene a meeting with stakeholders in his community because he was a little frustrated about all of the minor misconduct that he was seeing in his juvenile courtroom. He's the chief juvenile court judge in Clayton County, Georgia. And like many judges here in North Carolina, felt that he didn't really have the time he needed to devote to some of those more serious and violent cases because his docket was clogged every day with school fights, disorderly conduct, minor theft, and things like that coming from the schools. What came out of that conversation was a school justice partnership. He didn't call it that at the time, but ultimately became what we now know is a school justice partnership. Today, as a result of that work, Clayton County has seen almost a 68% reduction in their school-based referrals. They've seen a reduction in referrals of youth of color, so they've improved their disproportionate contact. They've also seen a vast reduction in serious weapons on campus, so school safety has improved. There are less disciplinary referrals, and graduation rates have gone up. And Judge Corpening likes to say, who would have ever thought that if you keep kids in school, the graduation rate would increase? Well, guess what? That's what happened. It's also happened in his county. In New Hanover, graduation rates have gone up. They also have seen a 67% reduction in school-based referrals since the School Justice Partnership was implemented. And as you saw in the video, one of the most important statistics that I've seen based on New Hanover County's partnership is the difference in the number of students who end up in the court system after being referred to a school resource officer. So what this does is it gives school resource officers more tools so that whenever they do have to intervene, the response is not send them to court 99% of the time. Now, the school resource officer knows, maybe I can send this child to teen court, or to this mediation program, or to this mental health provider for an evaluation, because maybe there's some underlying mental health issue going on. This is about giving school officials and officers more tools so that we can keep kids out of court and in the school system. And I just think that's a very important statistic to emphasize, because again, the goal is not to stop holding kids accountable. It's to more effectively address the behavior, and that's what they've been able to do. Brunswick County is one of our newer school justice partnerships. I believe they signed theirs in 2017, I believe, Judge Corpening. And they have already seen a 42% reduction in school-based referrals. And this is the overall school-based complaints for Brunswick County, and you can see the decline here. But when you look at the demographic information and look at the demographics of the students, we can also see that when you look at just the black students, they've had over 40% reduction in the number of black students who are being referred to court, as well as a reduction in Hispanic kids, white youth, and then all other youth of color. So across the board, we are seeing, or New Hanover County is seeing less referrals of youth of color to court, and that's a great thing. We also see, if you look by gender and age, that the numbers have decreased significantly. There still seems to be a disproportionate number of boys than girls, and that's sort of common throughout the state. But the fact that all of the numbers as a whole are going down is very positive. Mecklenburg County is the second longest school justice partnership district in North Carolina. They've had a partnership since 2016, and they have experienced a 60% total reduction in school-based referrals to court. Mecklenburg County, actually Wake County has the largest school district in the state, right?
Right.
And then maybe Mecklenburg is second. So lots of students there. So this is a big deal. Mecklenburg County has significantly reduced its juvenile justice population. And as one of the counties in the state with the highest rate of juvenile crime, this is a big deal for them because they have increased their capacity to handle Raise the Age when it happens in December, because their numbers are so low as a result of the success of their school justice partnership. And then the same with Brunswick County. When you look at disproportionality, we see that kids of color are being, less kids of color are being referred to court across the board. There's still the gender gap, but I know that they are working to improve that and have some great strategies that they are engaged in. Our website has the toolkit available. I've got a few copies, hard copies here if you'd like to take one. I don't have enough hard copies for everyone, but I would encourage you to come and get one or to download it from our website. If you're interested in learning more about School Justice Partnership, you can reach out to us at the Administrative Office of the Courts. I'm the primary contact for School Justice Partnership, but I can tell you that this is one of the Chief Justice's key initiatives and key goals for the North Carolina court system. She is very, very concerned about the youth in North Carolina and is dedicated to the success of this program. So we are putting lots of resources into this initiative. I have been around the state speaking to various groups, stakeholders like yourselves, and this is just a really, really important opportunity for us, because the one group that we have really been trying to speak to for the last 2 years and have had trouble getting in front of is educators. So we are grateful for this opportunity. I hope that you have lots of questions, that you are interested in pursuing this program in your county, and whatever help you need, we are here to help. So thank you.
Thank you.
And Judge Corpening, I wanted to give him an opportunity to talk and answer any questions that you guys might have. I'm going to take a seat, and then if you guys have questions, we're happy to answer.
So I'm going to get the questions?
Yes, all the questions.
So just a couple of comments before we do take questions, and we do want to take your questions. First, this isn't something I cooked up in my backyard in Wilmington. This is a nationally based, evidence-based model. Steve Teskey has worked in 40 different states. Through a partnership I've got with Georgetown University, I've worked with jurisdictions, probably 15 states or so, at least jurisdictions within states. I was in Cincinnati last month. I'm going to be in Portland next month. I'm going to be in New York in February. This is the real deal, and it's happening all over the country. And so I'm thrilled that North Carolina is working to take this statewide. It's important for you to hear from me that the reason that I started doing this work, I started actually working our project, my partnership with my friend Tim Markley in Wilmington. We started in 2013. It took us a while to get it developed. But school safety was the reason we did this work. It's about making schools safer. It happens to fit with Raise the Age, and Raise the Age is what's brought us to you. But school safety is the reason that we did this work, because as we seek to change behavior, which is the whole purpose of discipline, we make schools safer. As we address the needs of our students in schools, we make schools safer. My superintendent says our schools are safer than they've ever been before, ever. Coincidentally, our school resource officers are spending more time in school than they ever have before. They're not down at the juvenile court counselor's office asking permission to charge a kid, or sitting in adult court for court date after court date. And by the way, come December 1st, there's not going to be any more cite and release. If they're under 18, they're going to have to go downtown, see the court counselor, see intake. The time they're going to spend away from the school building is going to magnify. So school safety is huge. For us, it was also about actually paying attention to brain science and two different parts of brain science. For us guys in particular, frontal lobe development. One of the reasons for the gender gap, it's real for us guys. But frontal lobe development, impulse control, being drawn to risk, the inability to appreciate risk, those functions in the frontal lobe aren't fully developed until about age 26. So there's no mystery why your car insurance goes down at 26. It's about data. There's no mystery why you can't rent a car in America until you're 26. It's data. But yet we expect a 17-year-old or a 15-year-old to be a fully functioning adult. Now, just because they think they are doesn't mean they are, right? So we're paying attention to that part of brain science and recognizing that their brains are driving some of that behavior without them appreciating any long-term consequence. And so we're finally paying attention to that. The second part of brain science that we're really beginning to pay attention to in New Hanover County is brain science driven by trauma. We are working to become a resilient community. We have endorsed the ACEs study. In Wilmington, we actually have identified a pair of ACEs, both the ACEs study and the questions related to childhood experiences, the adverse childhood experiences, but we have found that we've got environmental issues that are also ACEs that we're having to work to respond. And when we're dealing with children who've experienced trauma, we see behavior that suddenly is not explained. Behavior that, that we used to push out of school, behavior that we used to send to court. And it's driven by trauma. And if we don't ever address the trauma, then we're not ever going to change the behavior. We're just going to make things worse. And so we're really working on both of those pieces of brain science as part of our
response. We've seen a real mindset shift in our schools. I was with our Board of Education last night. I told them I was coming here today. They actually moved me up on the agenda a little bit because they felt sorry for me for running the road today. But I was there last night to ask our board to adopt as policy having every employee of our school system trained in youth mental health first aid. And when I left, the board tasked the superintendent with developing a policy to train 4,000 employees in youth mental health first aid in the next 12 to 18 months. That's part of the mindset shift we're experiencing. We're looking at, what happened to you as opposed to what did you do. Still trying to address the behavior, still trying to have a component of discipline, but there's a difference between discipline and punishment. We're trying to get back to discipline, which has a component of punishment, but the root of the word discipline is to teach. And if we are really going to help kids change the behavior, then we've got to pay attention to that. Just a quick anecdotal story about collateral consequences and why this work is so important. You heard me talk in the video about consequences for kids of getting tagged with an arrest. I got a call from one of my Pender County principals earlier this year. I had done a presentation with all the middle and high school principals in Pender. We're trying to get that work done, but Hurricane Florence just derailed us for a while in Pender County. So he called me and said, I really appreciate your presentation. I've got a young man who graduated from my high school last year. He's a great kid, great student. He wants to be in the Air Force. He wants to be in Air Force intelligence. He went to the recruiter and he's talking to the recruiter about his goals, his dreams. He self-reports to the recruiter that he got in a fight at school when he was 15, that he got charged, he went to teen court, it got dismissed, and the recruiter said, I'm so sorry. We're glad to have you in the Air Force, but you don't qualify for intelligence. And so the young man called his friend, his principal, and said, can you help me? So I said to the principal, are you sure he was 15? First question. And the principal said yes. And I said, well, I think there's good news here, because that meant he would not have been charged. If he had been referred to juvenile court, there wouldn't have been a charge. He wouldn't have been arrested. I was able to check our juvenile system through my chief court counselor. I checked the adult system just in case. He had been 16. He was never charged. He did go to teen court, successfully completed, but he was never sent to court. And I was able to tell the principal that. Principal called the recruiter back and said, I've talked to the judge. He's verified he was not ever charged. He was 15. He would have been in juvenile jurisdiction, but he was never referred to court. The recruiter said, that's great news. And guess who is in the Air Force on the way to a career in Air Force intelligence now? If he'd been 16, and if he'd been sent to court, life-changing. It's real. We got to pay attention. So we're happy to answer any questions that you have. And thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today.
Thank you. Before we open it up for questions, I just want to pause to quickly again say thank you for this presentation. Board members, I think we all can feel sort of the gravity of the conversation. These are the sort of discussions that I think children in North Carolina have been begging and pleading for folks in positions like ours to be having for quite some time. And so to be able to have a fact-filled discussion, a cross-sector relationship as well, and understanding how we're really interdependent, our systems bleed into each other, I think is hugely important. And as a reference point, this does correlate with our goal one and our objective one in our strategic, our 2020-25 plan. As a point of personal privilege, before we open it up to questions, I'd like to ask a question, if that's okay. It seems as if the school justice partnership, part and parcel of that is the overall reduction in exclusionary discipline writ large for kids. And I noticed that when you look at the partnerships, although we're in the early stage, that Guilford County was not up there. We're in Guilford County, of course. Have you all given any thought to this notion of students being able to appeal short-term suspensions? Because in the North Carolina General Statute right now, as it stands, students cannot appeal a suspension to their principal unless there's a local LEA policy that permits them to do that. That issue is being contested and debated here locally. And so I wondered, is that a potentially viable part? Is that included in the toolkit, or is that something you all have given thought to as a pathway to reducing overall suspensions?
So I think the short answer is no, we haven't done that yet. I think that's a great issue to look at and talk about. I will tell you that the reason why we did the kickoff for the toolkit in Guilford County is because Guilford County was getting ready to start the process. Their chief district judge passed away, as you're probably aware. He was the convener, and so I think they're well on their way. The new superintendent here actually was the superintendent in Clayton County, Georgia, when the program started there. And so what a connection to have in Guilford County. So I can tell you that process is underway. I think you bring up a really good point with the short-term suspensions. As you know, due process doesn't kick in until after those 10 days. And so I think it's something that we can definitely look at moving forward. And I will tell you, one of the other roles that I serve in is the governor has now appointed me to be the chair of the Safer Schools Task Force, which Mr. Duncan is also on, the vice chair of your school board. And I think you guys actually have one more appointment to that board. And we would love for this to be one of those issues that we can work on with the Safer Schools Task Force and with the State Board of Education to figure out what is the best way to handle that moving forward and look at those exclusionary practices.
And I'll just add, to be very honest, no, we had not looked at the due process for short-term suspensions. I think that is an extremely important issue for us to consider as part of this initiative. And what I wanted to point out is that the toolkit is an evolving document. We are constantly speaking with stakeholders. Again, I'm so happy to be here today and have a group of educators who can hear about this work and give us feedback and give us ideas and additional tools that we need to include. So I would love to have more conversation about that and consider that issue as we continue to work to improve this program.
And I'll add just briefly, when we first signed our agreement in New Hanover County, we didn't specifically address suspension. We did specifically address behavior and say, before any discipline is imposed, you're to consider these factors. And we listed some factors to consider, like age and mental health status, whether they have an IEP, lots of factors that we listed as factors to consider before imposing discipline. One of the things we've run into is, as we travel around the state, is the statutory right of principals to suspend. And so that gets thrown up. Well, you're not going to take away the principal's statutory right to suspend, and that's exactly right. I'm not asking anybody to take away a right. We're asking law enforcement and principals to actually exercise discretion. Nobody's trying to take away a right. But that's sort of been the headbutt that we run into some. We're seeing our suspensions come down in New Hanover, and we're excited about that, and we're hoping to continue to work that. And I have to give I don't get to have a moment of personal privilege when I'm in your room, but I have to shout out to Greene County. They're one of the counties that I worked with, and I'd never been to Snow Hill before. I had trouble finding my way, but when I got there, I found a remarkable school district, and they're doing some great things. I just had to share that.
Board members, we have about 5 minutes, so questions, please. The floor is open. Dr. Miller?
Thank you, Judge Courtney, and we appreciated you visiting us and working with us to get our partnership started. Thanks to the work of Judge Beth Heath. She brought you down, and we began the process. And I wanted to respond to something you said, too, about having a difficult time getting in front of educators, and that has happened. And I wanted to address some of those concerns that were raised by some education groups, and they talked about what you talked about, Judge Corcoran. And I think that they viewed these MOUs not as a living, breathing document that can be modified to fit the needs of the district, but rather something that could potentially handcuff administrators and take away the type of consequences that are available to them, and that is not our experience at all. In fact, what we've seen is that the consequences available to us have broadened because we have begun thinking about alternatives to suspension and some other things that really were not part of the school justice partnership but were a natural outgrowth of that work. Another thing that I think is some folks saw this as an attempt to hijack local student codes of conduct, and that is also not what these are about. What these MOUs are about is bringing awareness to an issue that has been embedded in the fabric of education since Brown versus Board of Education. And another thing that this is an effort to reduce the saturation of referrals of school-age children into the juvenile justice system. And I think that we've been able to reduce those and reduce them significantly using teen court, using alternatives to suspension. And I would be remiss as a superintendent and a signer of an SJP if I didn't take this opportunity to try to bring some of those concerns to light and just say that in Greene County we have not experienced any of those issues. It has all been very positively received. In fact, Judge Heath met with us, with the sheriff, principals, SROs, and me last week to do our quarterly data review, and it went very well. And looking forward to our next one. Maybe we'll invite you to come
Please
do a
please
return
do. I know the
visit.
way now.
There you go. Maybe we'll eat some barbecue afterwards this time.
Yes, sir.
Vice Chair Duncan, and then quickly Matt Bristow.
Thank you for the presentation. One of the things for those of us of a certain age, when we went to school, there were not such things as SROs in the schools, and it was the responsibility of the principal or a vice principal designated for that purpose to take the primary charge for handling discipline within the school. The dynamic has changed over a period of time, with SROs providing a valuable assistance to our overall school life, but at the same time, and if we're straightforward, in some communities creating some tension about whether or not that has led to further criminalization of conduct in schools that may not have traditionally been viewed in that way. I think a lot of times in the education community there's some hesitancy to not assess sufficient viewing of what the responsibility of the educators are, because there's a great deal of instances, and I think those of us who have served on local boards have seen this, where there's an over-reliance on the SRO, and if there was anything that came up in terms of a disciplinary thing, it was referred immediately to SRO as opposed to the traditional handling by educators of those issues. I don't know that there's a real priority on our most precious resource of school administrators, which is time. They're called upon to do so much. But at the same time, is going to be embedded at some point in this process that there's additional training about how to best coordinate the educators' responsibilities for discipline, which are not gone simply because an SRO's in the building, but rather how to appropriately accommodate the necessary responsibilities between the parties who are there to help our students.
That's an excellent point, and one of the things that I know Judge Corpening does in his district, he does a training that's called When to Call 911. And you know, one of the examples that we often talk about is if a child in your own house, your own kid, flipped over the chair at the dinner table, would you call the cops? Why do we do it in schools when that happens? And so really helping teachers to think through when is the appropriate time to involve law enforcement in that. So a couple of things that we've done over the last year to try to change those dynamics a little bit is we, for the first time, are now requiring all school resource officers must be trained. They must go through 40 hours of basic training. That went into effect this year as part of their standard. So within the first year of them being put on a school campus, they have to do that. And I think that's really going to change the dynamic, because in those 40 hours, they get things such as how to work with kids with disabilities, how to recognize mental health problems among kids, how do you actually engage with those different types of populations looking at equity issues. And so those are all part of that 40-hour block that they're required to go to now. Is it a panacea? Will it fix all the problems? Absolutely not. But it is part of what we saw in the past was that a lot of times school resource officers were being placed in schools with absolutely no training on how to work with kids. You send a teacher for 4 years to education at a university, and these officers were coming in with no training. And so this will give them at least a basic level of training when they come into those schools, and really start them thinking down that process of how should we view our job differently. This is not about stuffing and cuffing kids. This is about really how do we create relationships and create an environment where we are the role model for that kid about what law enforcement should be and how law enforcement should treat you in the future. And if we mess this up on that first impression, it has a lasting impression on that kid for the rest of their life that law enforcement's out to get them instead of out to help them. And so we really want to make sure with those officers that we're training on those basic skills.
And I'll just add that as part of the information in the toolkit, we strongly suggest that every district that implements a school justice partnership include mandatory training for all teachers and school officials on the distinction between school officials and SROs in responding, or their role in responding to school-based misconduct. And we've also made a recommendation to the legislature through the Juvenile Jurisdiction Advisory Committee, which is a legislative committee overseeing the implementation of Raise the Age, that is making additional recommendations to the legislature to make that policy more successful. We've recommended adding a new requirement that as a part of the expansion of school justice partnership, it include a training component as well.
Clearly, that would impact tens of thousands of young people and their life opportunities. And I think implicit in this room is connecting the dots between the equity activity we had this morning, the messages we had yesterday about aligning our resources to try to achieve common outcomes. My question to you is this: where have you seen at a local district level the leadership that is leveraged to go from pre-justice projects to post-justice projects? Like, where are you seeing the leadership emerge? Is it coming from the school systems? Is it coming from the law enforcement? And like, what do those initial conversations look like to get the ball rolling?
So the initial conversation in New Hanover happened when I found out that Tim Markley liked coffee, and I invited him to a cup of coffee. It's literally that relationship piece where Tim and I sat down over a cup of coffee, shared our mutual shortcomings in our systems in serving kids, and looked at this thing out of Clayton County, Georgia, where outcomes were changing for children. And from there, we invited other friends to join us, and we gradually expanded our group to build a cross-system collaboration across the county. I think that our model and the national model that Teskey's developed starts with the chief district court judge being a convener. It doesn't have to be that, but collaboration between that chief, if the chief is going to convene, and the superintendent of schools is critical. We also had our chair of our Board of Education at every meeting. And so because of that policy piece, right, because superintendent is the superintendent, but if it becomes board policy, then you've got to have that support from the board too, and we built that in from day one.
Can I just briefly add that it has varied as well. For example, in Asheville, the mayor, what is it? It was the mayor of Asheville, right? No, Salisbury. I'm sorry. The mayor of Salisbury heard a presentation on school justice partnership months ago and said, why don't I have this in my county? And she was the one who was instrumental in bringing stakeholders together and getting the chief district court judge to start that conversation. And I think she's actually acting as the convener of that stakeholder group. So they're working on their partnership now because city and local officials wanted to do the work. but the Chief Justice has convened a meeting of all Chief District Court judges next week at the School of Government just to talk about school justice partnerships. Judge Corpening and I will both be there, and the whole purpose of that meeting is that the Chief Justice wants to empower judges to be able to go out and have these conversations. So we are going to be engaging in a work session with them to help them go through this process.
And I know you're out of time, but I got to add to that, because the model is to build relationships. The model is not for me to walk into Greene County and tell them what to do. And I didn't do that. That's not the model. The model is to build relationships across systems, because our kids do not live in silos. They don't. And so if we come together as a community across systems and work together across those systems, then we can change their lives.
I think this is a common theme, relationships across systems, relationships with the kids as well. I want to thank you once again for our panel from representing SJP and the work that you're doing. Unfortunately, we do have a lunch appointment with the dean here at the school, so we want to respect her time. But we're grateful for this conversation. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll turn it back over to you.